ALZ Talks webinars provide education, information, news, and resources on a variety of dementia and caregiving topics. This webinar series is supported by Procter Gamble and is organized and arranged by the Alzheimer's Association. Today we'll be talking about understanding and responding to dementia-related behaviors. I'm joined by two caregivers who have personal experience with dementia-related behaviors and have helped other caregivers respond to dementia-related behaviors as community educators. Julia is a caregiver for her grandmother and is a senior community educator with the Alzheimer's Association. Gene was a primary caregiver for his husband of 33 years. He retired to care for his husband, and after his husband passed away, he became a community educator and serves on his chapter's board. Welcome, Gene and Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here with us today. It's going to be a great time together. So let's get started, if that's okay. We'll just dive right into the first question because I know that dementia-related behaviors are an issue that a lot of people have questions about. So it'd be great to learn from your experiences here. So first, what do we mean when we talk about dementia-related behaviors, and what are some of the most common ones? Gene, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Sam, for that nice introduction as well. And, behaviors are expressed in ways such as anxiety or anger, sometimes suspicion, getting lost or wandering. And these are a form of communicating a need. For example, when my late husband, Art, would suddenly and quite uncharacteristically tell me to shut up, well, that meant that he was feeling overwhelmed with incoming information or noise, or I was talking too fast and he was unable to process what he was hearing, which is a very common symptom of Alzheimer's disease. I learned that behaviors are a result of the disease. In my experience with Art, as his disease progressed, it was almost as if he behaved in ways that were completely opposite of what his lifelong personality had been. He exhibited behaviors of impatience. He was argumentative at times. He expressed a lot of sadness. And at times he was accusatory or disorganized and confused. So those are just some of the examples that I noticed.
Yeah, thanks, Gene. Julia?
Yeah, so when it comes to behaviors, I think one of my favorite metaphors that we as community educators use is that behaviors are like this alarm that's telling you that one of your loved one's needs is not being met. They just don't have the words to communicate what that need is, so rather they're demonstrating that through behavior. It's very similar to how a baby is crying and the parents are there to try to figure out what the baby needs, whether they're hungry, their diaper needs to be changed, very similar to that. And sometimes these behaviors just come out of the blue. It doesn't seem to be triggered by anything. It may not make a lot of sense to us either if we could identify a trigger. But I think one of the first things I learned to come to terms with is that this behavior makes complete sense to our loved ones. And we may not fully understand why they're behaving in a certain way, but we as caregivers, we certainly should try so that we can help them live positive, fulfilling lives.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I know that a lot of times some people will say we need to focus on the feelings, not the facts, right? There's something there that's causing somebody to behave in a certain way. And many times it is something that we're doing that we could do differently. Maybe we're being impatient, right? But we'll talk more about that as we move on. So yeah, I mean, it really is really looking at what are those feelings behind those behaviors and how can we do something differently to connect with them instead of try to correct them. And so let's move into that a little bit. So um, how are communication and dementia-related behaviors connected? And Julie, let's start with you this time.
Yeah. So communication, it's more than the words that you're saying to someone. It's also your tone of voice, the stance that you take in front of them, even your facial expressions, however minute they are. The other person can pick up on those. And behaviors are a form of communication. And it's your loved one's reaction to the world around them when they start to lose the words to describe how they feel. So an example from my grandmother is, as the disease progressed during bath time in particular, my grandmother would start crossing her arms, acting upset all of a sudden, not something she typically would act like. And then we later found out that her reaction was more so due to being uncomfortable because maybe the water temperature wasn't how she wanted to be, or she was just very uncomfortable being so exposed in front of someone she didn't necessarily recognize at that time. So it was through further deep delving that we were able to kind of determine what the cause was and reassure her and address that feeling that she had.
Yeah. So it sounded like you did a little bit of research to sort of figure out what's going on so that then you could handle it better next time. Yeah. So Gene, how about you? What was your experience like with dementia-related behaviors and communication?
Sure. Well, one thing I really noticed was that Art would take his mood cues from me. So if I was feeling or if I was behaving cheerfully and always having a positive expression on my face and my body language, he would react in the same way. Those with dementia are constantly trying to figure out the environment around them. So depending on their caregivers for cues is really important. If I was having a bad day, that was very challenging because it would set him off into more of a bad mood as well. A person with dementia, their sense of feeling safe, secure, and confident can be quite diminished. For example, in our situation, Art would have unexpected sort of bouts of sadness and fear about his condition. And while I didn't always know what triggered these behaviors, I knew to help him at least get to a more happy place, to give him a reason to feel better. Um, Things like sharing photo albums of vacations or old memories that he would enjoy, or talking about his college days, which was a really important period in his life that he really treasured. So I would remind him about things that he had shared with me before. Um, and sometimes going for a drive in the car, especially if I told him we're going to stop and get an ice cream or something like that. So there were ways to alleviate his sadness or his fears, whatever might be going on.
Yeah, those are great examples, Gene, and I think you really stress the importance of really knowing the person that you're caring for. I mean, we have this concept called person-centered care that we talk about a lot, but it really is just, what families do on a daily basis. You know your family member and you know what they like and what they don't like, and you use that knowledge to really provide more individualized care. And so, and you know that think about it and think about if somebody was trying to make us do something that we didn't quite understand what you were telling us to do, you'd get frustrated, right? You would get frustrated, and I would yell. I can tell you that right now, I'd yell at you. And so, I mean, we think about if it's not registering, how can we do things differently, or do things in a different way, and potentially then make the whole experience different. And it sounds like, Gene, you had some great examples there. So let's dig a little bit deeper into maybe a specific behavior that was really challenging for you, and how you approached it or how you went about to try to understand it better. Gene, we'll start with you on this one.
Sure, sure. I just wanted to add to the example that Julia gave with her grandmother and bathing time, and that sometimes triggered some difficult behaviors. With me, it was just the opposite. Bathing time was the time when Art was really happy. He felt good. I think the warm water, the idea of someone helping him with a washcloth and so forth. So it's interesting how the same event can be different depending on the individual. And that's something we know, that if you know one person with Alzheimer's disease, you know one person because each person is a unique individual. But to get back to your immediate question here, one concept that I really struggled with at first was the idea of joining that person's reality, because the person with dementia, their reality becomes more and more skewed based on based on the disease itself. You know, their brain cells are being compromised, so their sense of reality can start to change. And I had to learn the hard way that concept, because Art had known that both his mother and father had passed away well before he was diagnosed with the disease. But one day he asked me if I was staying in touch with his mom and dad, who lived on the other side of the country. And, you know, this was still in the relatively earlier stage of his disease, so it caught me off guard. And I just thought it was a momentary lapse, but I just reminded him that his mom and dad had passed away years ago. Well, that was a very shocking revelation to him. It was like he was learning it all over again. So I
Well,
learned a hard lesson there, that you really do have to agree with their reality and try and work within that reality. Once I learned that, it was much easier to go with the flow when he would come up with, you know, strange ideas.
yeah, that's a great example, Gene. And I know that for many family members, that's really difficult because you're having to accept something that's different than what you thought it was going to be, right? Or who you thought, and that takes some time to get used to that. But like you said, I think once you make that switch, things could be a lot easier for everyone, right? The experience can be a lot more joyful and um, more focused on connection rather than that correction. So, Julia, how about your experience? How was it the same or different?
It was a little bit different because I think my grandmother was a very strong, independent woman. So she had manifested a couple of behaviors that were more towards like anger, aggression. So those were a bit more difficult to deal with, and probably one of the most challenging behaviors for me to address, since I was still in, I think, middle school, high school at that time. So I barely had control over my own feelings, let alone trying to address someone else's. And one thing that Jean had brought up was to embrace your loved one's sense of reality. And that brings up this topic where we as caregivers can't really change our loved one, but we can change how we respond to them. And I think that's always a helpful tip to keep in mind. And when it comes to behaviors, I always like to start by being a detective to try to look for some clues as to how this behavior manifested. Ask your who, what, when, where, how questions to delve a little bit deeper. So one of the examples when it came to anger, my grandmother actually had a verbal outburst with me in the midst of a really big grocery store, and we were surrounded by a whole lot of people. And the natural reaction when someone gets mad at you or angry is to be defensive, to react. But my key lesson in that moment in time was to take a step back, to count to three, and then respond. And in my response, to address how my grandmother was feeling in the moment rather than how she was acting. I recognized that we were selecting birthday cards, and as we know in grocery stores, there are a whole bunch of birthday cards to select from. There are so many choices. And sometimes choices can cause a lot of frustration. It can cause your loved one to feel overwhelmed. So likely, I figured that was the cause of my grandmother's frustration and why she acted in that way. So I try to help her reconcile the fact that, yes, there are so many choices, but let's just start with two. How about this one versus this one? Is there one that you like more? So to narrow it down for her, that helped her calm down a little bit. And one thing that I think that caregivers don't realize is that sometimes our natural reaction to behavior, whether that be like a little change in our facial expressions or our tone of voice, if it drops an octave and starts to sound like we're a little bit angry, that can actually trigger our loved one's behavior and escalate the behavior even further. So that's one point that I always kept in mind as I was addressing any behaviors.
Yeah, great examples there, Julia. one thing I think that is overall, I think, good tip for our whole lives, right? Is, and you might, if anybody's ever gone to counseling in any way, especially couples counseling, you know, we can only change our own behavior, right? We get into this loop that we're trying to get the other person to change their behavior. It's a good tip for life in general, right? We're only in control of our own behavior. So we focus on what we could do differently, and not what the other person could do differently. Um, I know you guys talked a little bit about anger, and I know other people might experience things like anxiety or agitation or suspicious, delusional type thoughts, and even, you know, getting lost and wandering. So there's a lot of different types of behaviors. But another thing that I wanted to stress that you brought up too was really about how you took those few minutes and just took a breath and thought about, how can I respond to this instead of react to this, right? Because if you react to this, you might just cause another behavior to happen, right? Or you might turn it into something bigger than it is. So I think that that little tip about counting to three and thinking about how I'm going to respond to this instead of how I'm just going to react to that behavior is a great one. So thank you. Um, let's move on to maybe some of those things that might actually trigger things to happen. You guys, we probably heard these words triggers, you know, things that sort of allow that behavior to happen. Like, for example, you know, the TV could be on really loud and it could be overwhelming to the person, and they're reacting to that overstimulation, but they don't know how to communicate that, right? So they might yell or something, or the way you're asking somebody to do something might be confusing. They don't understand the steps, and they might be reacting, you know, to that confusion. And so, what are some of examples that you guys could share with us that were triggers in your caregiving experience? And then, how did you approach them or change your approach to them to sort of make them better? And so, Julie, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, of course. So when it comes to triggers, they come in many different forms. They could be external, internal. So external triggers are more like of the environment, the people around the person. But when it comes to internal triggers, it's more so how that person is feeling, the sense of loss, sadness, feeling alone. So those are particularly hard to address because you really have to step into that person's shoes to imagine how they must be feeling. And sometimes we can't fully understand why they're feeling the way they're feeling or what kind of feeling they even have, but you can sense a little bit of an inkling of what they're feeling. And we can all relate to that. The feelings are always going to be true. If the facts are completely out of whack, that doesn't mean that the feelings are. So one thing that my grandmother was notorious for was she was always very suspicious when it came to like her items being stolen, and that was just a part of who she was. She's a very strong woman, and she is used to doing everything on her own. So when something happens, something that she didn't do, her natural reaction is to think something is wrong. And I think one time my grandmother had actually accused us of stealing from her when she couldn't find her purse. But in reality, she had misplaced her purse. She didn't put it in the usual place, so she actually didn't know where it was, and she couldn't retrace her steps to find it. So I think our first reaction as humans is to be defensive when it comes to suspicion and delusions. But it's important to look past that and try to empathize with how scared, alone they might feel, or how frustrated they are with themselves even, because surely they know something is going on where I can't do what I used to be able to do. So in that particular moment, I was able to put aside my feelings, of course, and empathize with how scared she must have felt, thinking that someone had taken something from her, that she was missing something and it could never be found, because that's how she must have felt in that moment. And from that perspective, we were able to start comforting her, assuring her that we were there to get to the bottom of the situation. We're there to support her. So that was one of more of an internal trigger. Of course, there are external triggers like the example of bath time that I mentioned earlier, with the water being too hot, too cold. That's something that could easily trigger a behavior as well.
Yeah. Great examples, Julia. Thank you. Gene, how about some of the triggers that your husband Art experienced?
Sure. Um, one of the things that Art really valued was his sleep hours and his nap times. He had always retired when he was diagnosed, so he had more time on his hands, and he was able to take advantage of those. He could independently regulate when he took his naps and so forth. But after he was diagnosed, the sleep interruptions were more common, and I had to be very careful not to wake him up too early in the morning, especially if there was something that we had to get to, either a doctor appointment or on Sunday mornings. He loved going to his church, uh, but it was always a struggle to get him up and out for that. So I had to find little ways of coaxing him, starting the process a little bit earlier, being more patient. And that was the one thing that I learned very quickly, is to be a patient person, which is not my true nature. I tend to move rather quickly. I like to multitask and get a lot of things done at one time, but I had to really learn to slow down and honor his feelings. Julie has done a great job of describing how we have to center on their feelings. Um, so if his sleep or his nap time were compromised, it would always result in some agitation, and he would get impatient and fitful. Another really difficult example to share with you is that um, Art would sometimes accuse me of being his jailer or keeping him in prison, and I fully understood where that came from because he was mostly housebound. For much of the time through his journey of his disease, I was still working, so I had to have other people, both professional caregivers, neighbors, friends, and so forth, come to the house to be with him an increasing amount of time. So if I found that he was in the house too many days in a row, that would create this sense that he was being kept as a prisoner. So I would have to find techniques to either go for a walk, maybe go for a little drive, just get him in a change of scenery. I was able to lean on one really good neighbor who said, "Gene, just call me when those things happen, and you can come over and you can sit at our swimming pool, or you come and have a cup of coffee with us, and that'll change the scenery for Art." Art always liked our neighbors, and he was a very friendly person, so that was a helpful technique to change that dynamic of him feeling so housebound. And just one more example would be, Art had real difficult time in busy or crowded or noisy environments. Um, a particular evening came to mind. It was a Christmas Eve with lots of family, lots of young kids, lots of noise, presents being opened. And at one point, Art just stood up and started yelling at everybody to be quiet and get out of my house. Well, it wasn't our house. We were at my nephew's house. So I just had to, that was a little bit of a difficult situation for the younger children because it was so sort of a shocking incident. But I let their parents take care of them, and I took care of Art, and we just went to a different part of the house, and we eventually went home a little earlier that night.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, I think we could forget about that, right? We could forget about how busy an environment can get so quickly. And, we're sort of used to all that stimulation, but for a person living with dementia, that could really be a trigger. So thank you both for sharing those personal examples. I'd like to, we're getting close to the end here, and so let's move into a little bit some of those those tips and techniques that we've talked about a lot of do this instead of that. Like we've talked about, focus on the feelings, not the facts, or respond, don't react, you know. So what are some other techniques or approaches that caregivers can do to sort of address behaviors in maybe a different way than we're used to? Um, Art, how about a couple things that you've used? And I know we've talked about some of these, so some of these might be repeats, but what were some of the things that you kept in mind as you thought about responding to behaviors?
Well, we talk about this person-centered approach to which is so important to consider the person's feelings and consider what's going on in their perception. The fact that I knew Art so well, we were together for so many years, I could always rely on those aspects of his values, his history, what he personally preferred in his lifestyle, and that was my way of facilitating effective communication. Um, Boredom was something that neither of us liked. So to prevent that and to honor his sort of life desires, I could always read to Art. He was a real book reader, but he lost that ability because of his Alzheimer's. In fact, that was one of the first signs that something was not right. He loved reading books, and he had stopped reading because he said he couldn't remember the page before. So I would read to him, and that would give him a sense of participation and so forth. Or we would, as I said earlier, we would look at photographs, or just sit and cuddle and be just be close to each other. Maybe look at a picture magazine or a live webcam or something like that. So just knowing the person well enough, you're able to focus on those aspects of their lives that give them comfort and security and so forth. And the last thing I'll just say is that, slowing down, speaking in slower and shorter sentences would be a real helpful way of communicating with him as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Julia, how about from your experience?
I think from my experience, like I said before, take a step back, count to three, and then respond. That's one of my mantras that I lived by going through these behaviors. And one thing that I always thought of that I would always tell everyone else is it didn't matter what I had to do for my grandmother, but as long as she was happy, that's all that mattered to me. If I had to play along, go with the flow, tell her that she was the same age as I was, because that was one of her big things. That didn't matter to me, because as long as I kept her happy, that's at the end of the day what was most important. And one thing that I found that was really helpful and so easy to do throughout her entire journey, and now we're in the latest stage, is to keep smiling, keep laughing, because your smile and your laugh, it's contagious. And that's even true day to day. When you smile at someone, they smile back at you. They mirror that emotion and that behavior back towards you. So that was, for me, was really important, because I noticed that just a simple smile towards her, she smiled right back. And that calmed us down, that got us to connect even further, even though we weren't speaking. That was still a form of connection between us.
Yeah, that's great advice for just for life, right? We all need to smile a little bit more, I think. Um, so one thing that I know, we Gene, when we've talked earlier, you talked about not sweating the small stuff, and I think I gave an example of something that I used to use is really, and it kind of goes along with your sort of 3 second rule, Julia, is really I would stop and think of, so what? So what? And in my mind I say that because, you know, so what? So what if the forks are where the spoons are? So what if he called me my brother's name? It's okay. In the long word, like you said, as long as we're happy, as long as we're connecting, so what? So think about that. We all a few different tips I think that we all shared that people might find helpful, but I think it all goes down to really taking a few minutes to think about how you're going to respond instead of just reacting from the hip and then causing more problems. So, thank you for sharing all that. So, you know, I think as we close, let's think about some of the resources that are in the community that might be able to help caregivers like yourselves. And I know you guys are also community educators for the Alzheimer's Association in your areas, and so we appreciate all you do to help share your experiences with others. And What are some resources that you might recommend in your area for caregivers, or any types of resources for caregivers? Gene, would you like to start?
Sure, sure. The first thing I say when people ask me what would I have done differently, and that is I would have asked for more help from my network of connections. I'm not one that easily can ask people for help. Feel like I have to do it on my own. But as a caregiver for someone with dementia, this is a 24/7 proposition, and it is a progressive disease, so it's going to get more challenging as time goes on. So I would have asked for, I would have built a team of support with all of those people. I eventually learned how to do that, but it would have caused less stress on my part. The Alzheimer's Association has tremendous amount of support and resources that can we can get referrals from them. One example is that I never thought about the fact that the Veterans Administration could help me with respite care. Art was a veteran and qualified for benefits that allowed me to get a certain number of days a year when they would take him under their care in their long-term facility, and it would give me some time to recuperate from the stress of caregiving. So I would rely heavily on the Alzheimer's Association for the ability to get referrals for other resource. A day program, for example, an adult day program was very helpful in our case. So um, I'll let Julia comment on others that she might be aware of as well.
Yeah. Before you go there, I think, Gene, you bring up a really important point about respite, which a lot of families aren't aware of or don't even understand that it exists, right? There's respite in your community, like adult day or in-home care. And respite, that word might be unfamiliar to people, but it really is all about getting a break, right? So how can you get a break as a caregiver while the person who's living with dementia really is in a supportive environment and being cared for in a great way, in a person-centered way. And respite could be very informal. It could be a friend coming over and giving you an hour to go to the brain, to the gym, or to the grocery store, or it could be more formal, like some of the things that you've described. But we know that caregivers are better caregivers when they have breaks, because you can't be a good caregiver if you're not taking care of yourself. You have to make sure that you're in good health and you're taking care of yourself and you're emotionally and physically healthy, so that you could then give the care that you want to provide to your family members. So, Julie, what are some resources that you've learned about or that you've used?
Yeah, of course. I think growing up, for me, there was a lot of stigma and embarrassment in my family surrounding the disease. So it was very hard for us to reach out for support. So I think reaching out for support, definitely a great first step. And also to be open to learning more. Sometimes we always think, oh, well, we'll just deal with it as it comes. But with this disease, it's so important to know more about it, know what to expect, even if it's more generalized. And I think one of the most important things that the Alzheimer's Association has to offer, and of course it's free, like all the resources are our education programs that are hosted both virtually and in person all across the US. So it's not just here or there, it's everywhere. And one particular series of education programs that I really love is the Empowered Caregiver series. There's really so much information in there when it comes to caregiving that we already inherently know as caregivers, but programs like these are such a great foundation to recognize the tips that we are already using in our day-to-day life and build upon those. So I think it's always really hard to know where to start as a caregiver if you're just starting out. You don't feel like you know what you're doing, but really it's just important to start somewhere. And I think programs, reaching out for support, that's a great start for someone who's on their caregiving journey, caregiving for one of their loved ones or friends.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. We've really filled up the time together today. Really appreciate you both sharing your experience. I mean, you're great examples of how you took this experience and really grew with it, and really showed how you could be the best caregivers you could be. We all make mistakes, right? I'm sure you could tell us plenty of mistakes that you made here and there, but overall, you looked at ways that you could connect over time and really make the caregiving experience the best it could be. So thank you both for being here and sharing your insights with us. Thank you all for joining us on ALZ Talks and being part of this. I'm sorry that we went a little longer, so we don't have time for live questions, but you could definitely send us questions you might have through our email address at alztalks@alz.org. Just to remind everyone, the association is available to anyone who has questions or needs supports. We have a 24/7 helpline at 800-272-3900. Specialists are available around the clock, 365 days a year, can provide assistance in 200 languages, thanks to translation services and bilingual staff. You could learn about, things about the disease that you want to know about. You could find information about local programs, where's there a support group taking place today? You could get information on those types of programs that Julia talked about, like the Empowered Caregiver, which is a great new program for caregivers. And you could also speak confidentially to a master's level clinician and talk through something that you're having issue with. Make some decisions, get some support in making decisions, or just dig deeper in an issue that you might be going through. And then additionally, on our website, there's a wealth of information at alz.org. So information about the disease process, about treatments, around tools and resources. And some things like Community Resource Finder can help you find services in your area by using an online tool. The Education Center can tell you all about these programs. So if you don't want to attend a program or attend a virtual program, you could use an online program. So you can take the Empowered Caregiver online. And then lastly, there's also ALZ Connected, which is our online message board community. So again, if you don't have time to go to a support group, you could chat with somebody and see what other people are talking about and experiences that they're having. So just remind everybody again, if you have any additional questions or you're looking for resources, feel free to email us at alztalks, alztalks@alz.org. And thank you so much and have a great day. And I want to just thank Jean and Julia one more time. So thank you, and I appreciate that. And everybody have a great day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.